Welcome to MMA True Fan, a biographical podcast series on legendary mixed martial artists. In this episode on Ken Shamrock, hear exclusive interviews with Jerry Bohlander, Frye, Tito Ortiz, Ken Shamrock, and more. Please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening.
There's two different Kens. Back then, Ken was intense. He was serious. There was no, you didn't see Ken joke. You didn't see Ken laugh. Ken was all fucking business. For a young guy, that was intimidating.
Like I said, he was like a big brother, and it was a trip seeing how Ken took me from this kid that only knew Taekwondo, didn't know anything about wrestling or grappling, and then turned me into this guy who wasn't awesome at any one thing, but I was proficient at everything.
These are superhuman numbers, superhuman endeavors. Hence you get the superhuman athlete, which Ken in his prime was superhuman. He was unbelievable.
MMA True Fan presents Ken Shamrock by Rich Donahue and Nate Evans.
In 1997, ABC News ran a documentary called The World's Most Dangerous Things. All types of categories were covered, from cities to animals. When it came time to name the world's most dangerous man, they showcased a charismatic, handsome champion. He represented the UFC and introduced the mainstream audience to a new sport taking shape in America, mixed martial arts. That man was Ken Shamrock.
Ken was born Kenneth Wayne Kilpatrick on February 11th, 1964, at Robins Air Force Base in Warner Robins, Georgia. He spent his first few years there, along with his three brothers. Warner Robins was a poor neighborhood, and there was racial tension between the Kilpatrick boys and the predominantly black community. Diane worked as a waitress and a dancer, and their father was busy as an Air Force enlistee, so the boys were mostly left to fend for themselves. By age 5, Ken's birth father, Richard, abandoned the family. Diane was now a single mother, who tried her best, but was non-disciplinarian. The boys raised themselves, in the streets, surrounded by violence. Ken took us back.
I had two brothers, one a year apart from each other. So, if I was 5, the other one 6, 7, and we were pretty much predominantly the only white family in that neighborhood. We grew up in a really poverty area. So I want you to remember the kind of neighborhood we grew up in, and going to kindergarten, we were fighting. You just don't see those things at a young child like that, but that's just the neighborhood I grew up in. And we were constantly battling and fighting with everybody in the neighborhood because of the color of our skin. Of course, kids that young didn't understand that. They just knew what they saw on TV. And
not long after, Diane remarried to a man named Bob Nance. He was another military man, this time with the Army. The new family packed up and drove west to Napa, California. Along the way, the Kilpatrick brothers found out how different life would be in the Nance household. Coming from an Army background, Bob was very strict and tried to put the boys on the straight and narrow. The problem was, frankly, they were too far gone.
We'd never been raised, so we were wild children. There was nobody ever tell us what to do, how to do it. We just grew up. And so here we were in the back of this 69 Camaro, being told to sit still and getting back cans, driving down down the state highway there, getting smacked in the face. We were getting out of hand and stuff, and we stopped at these hotels, and basically we were being put in a straitjacket, and we just didn't know how to do that.
The Kilpatrick brothers, now the Nances, still felt like fish out of water in the sun-soaked California valley. They grew up poor, and their classmates didn't. Their southern accents stood out like sore thumbs. Ken had to establish himself the only way he knew how, with his fists.
I remember one time in school, a bunch of guys started circling around, and I was in a lower grade than my two older brothers, so I was on the playground by myself with all these kids that were just weird to me, and they were definitely dressed much nicer than what I was used to, so all of a sudden these couple kids started gathering around and started pointing fingers at me, and of course in my mindset, because of where I came from, the first thing I thought of was I need to get my back against the wall, because I felt like, trouble's coming, and I need to make sure I didn't get jumped. So as they approached, they started talking, which is really not where I came from, what was even used to, because a lot of times, most of the time, you never see it coming. And if you did, there was no talking. People just went. And but these guys were standing there. What do you think? You're tough, and all this stuff. And in my mind, I'm trying to wrap my head around what's happening. Like, are they literally trying to fight me, or are they trying to be my friend? For the way they're talking, they're not very nice. And so they said a word I knew, which was, hey, meet me behind the gym at 3:00. We're going to fight. As soon as they said fight, I just hit them. And I understood that word. And so that once I did that, I put the boots to the kid, and I'm 10 years old at this time. So you imagine punching a kid and kicking him in the head with these shoes on and making sure he stays down, because I still had other guys to deal with. And as I was doing that, I remember waiting for something to hit me so I could turn and hit that spot. But it never happened. And I remember looking up, and they were running off. From that point on, I kind of made my existence felt by everyone, and I wasn't messed with too much. And if I was, it was usually by kids that were a little bit older, and usually more than one at a time. And they weren't the nicest kids. They were like me, where they were growing up rough.
Bob ruled the household with an iron fist. He tried to institute discipline on his stepsons with chores and sports. He took them camping. Misbehavior was punished with beatings, and there were many.
We didn't even know how to sweep a floor or take a trash can out. We just never did any of that. So he was trying to teach us how to be men and to pull weeds and then clean cars and do chores and clean toilets and make our bed and all these other things. And every time that he would ask us to do it, we would do it, but it wasn't up to his standard. And so it led to him getting frustrated, because every time he asked to do something, we didn't do a good job. And so because he came up from the military, he had these things that he did. And so it was a very volatile situation, because it got out of hand where he was hitting us with wooden handles and smacking us and just beating on us, taking his belt off and beating us with a belt buckle. And it was all led to this frustration of him trying to teach us these rules and these discipline, and it just didn't work.
The boys refused to be tamed. They stole what they wanted, from food to toys. They fought whenever challenged. Although Ken avoided it, some of his brothers started to take drugs. Late-night trips to the police station or hospital were commonplace for Bob Nance. Looking back, Ken doesn't blame his stepfather. He recognized what he and his brothers were at that time, and Bob was trying his best.
Yeah, listen, and it's no mark on him. Just like him backgammon us, driving down the road, we were not good kids. We were very, very much untamable.
But for a 10-year-old Kenny Nance, enough was enough. He ran away.
I was on the run for 3-4 months, living out of a car. I had robbed 5 or 6 different stores, and then I was strong-arm robbery, which I was wanted for. So when I finally got caught, I got stabbed behind a 7-Eleven, which was behind the Pueblo Vista School, and I woke up in the hospital handcuffed to a bed.
Once he was released, he was sentenced to juvenile hall for 6 months. Ken was only 10 years old in a lockup with kids as old as 17, some of them violent. Ken relied on the only things he had: his pride, his rage, and his fists. In his book, Beyond the Lines Den, he said, "I fought, always fought, but most nights it was hard to sleep because of the lumps on my face and the blood draining down the back of my throat." Despite this, he found the juvenile hall to be relaxing in a way. He didn't have to worry about where his next meal was coming from or where he was going to sleep. Ken returned home and went right back to raising hell with his brothers. Bob was working multiple jobs and wasn't getting much support from Diane in regards to disciplining the boys. The stress was insurmountable, and after nearly a decade, he'd had enough. Bob told his stepsons they no longer lived at home. He then placed a call with the authorities and told them the boys were living in the streets. The Nance brothers were picked up and became wards of the state.
The brothers went their separate ways, and Ken found himself in foster care. He bounced around from one place to the next. Nothing seemed right. Every situation seemed geared to help the care providers more than the kids. In some cases, the kids bullied their way into controlling the situation. He was starting to think nothing could work. Then one fateful day, Ken was driven to Susanville, California. He passed through a gated driveway and into a large ranch with a beautiful home. This was the Shamrock boys' home. and its owner, Bob, greeted Ken at the door. He knew right away this was different.
I was searching for something better, and I don't mean consciously, I mean unconsciously. I knew there was something better. It had to be. And so I would run away from these homes that had no structure and that weren't raising these kids properly. And so I ended up at the Shamrock Boys Home, my last chance. And that's where I really found security and comfort, was because I wasn't just a number anymore. I wasn't somebody that was housed and that you earned days if you did good. It was literally somebody who literally cared about me as a person, wanted to help me get through this anger and this frustration I felt inside of me.
Bob Shamrock and his wife Dee Dee opened the Shamrock Boys Home in 1968. Bob sold his fabrication business and purchased a 6,400 square foot ranch. They wanted to continue to build on the group they started in Anza, California. Bob had a big heart, fostered by his father, who ran a mission on Skid Row. He offered food to the homeless, and Bob helped out. The Shamrock Boys Home took in delinquents from 13 to 16.
Unlike the previous places Ken had been assigned to, Bob and Dee Dee didn't treat the boys as a product. They developed the boys with love, respect, and community. Bob kept the boys under his care busy and tired. They performed community service around town, cleaning highways and businesses. They cut wood for the home. If things got a little unruly, Bob would break out the boxing gloves and have the boys fight in a monitored environment. It wasn't a pit fight. He gathered the rest of the tenants as an audience, served drinks, and kept a light tone. No one was forced to fight if they didn't want to. Bob knew the boys needed a father figure, not a security guard. He demanded respect, but always returned the favor. He led by example, not corporal punishment. If you behaved, you were rewarded with the privilege of having a guest, trips to the movies. You might even be allowed to drive one of Bob's classic cars into town. The Shamrock Boys Home was a place of love and family. Bob and Dee Dee had a keen eye for what motivates a child, recognizing the talent and ambition within. They wanted to turn negatives into positives.
This kid had drawn this picture of everybody getting their heads cut off and bodies laying on the ground with blood everywhere. And there was this guy standing on top of the bodies holding two heads and said, kill them all. Well, when he drew this at school, the teachers freaked out. Like, oh my goodness, this guy's crazy, and they sent him home. And I remember my mom looking at that picture, and it was a really detailed picture. And she looked at it, and she saw beyond the frustration and the violence in the picture, and she saw talent. And I remember she said, you can't draw this at school, but because we had study hour every night at the table. She says, but I want you to draw whatever you want to draw here in an hour. I want you to be able to draw what you want to draw and how you feel. And so he would do that for a while, and the pictures were really good. Well, and then she started having a conversation with him, saying, well, those are really good. And then we were doing an addition onto the house. And I remember we had to draw these specs and everything, and had to draw the thing on there, and she had this kid help him. And this kid started to understand that it wasn't just about the violence in that picture. It was about his release of his frustration. And so my mom said that was a good opportunity to be able to understand that he can still be important, but he has to learn how to draw things differently. And so he started helping draw the addition onto the house, learn how to do all the measurements. And now all of a sudden, this kid is now all of a sudden relevant in his drawings. And so the kid went on to college and now he's an architect.
In Ken, Bob saw a quiet but intense young man with clear athletic gifts. He also saw the rage he bottled inside him. Violence surrounded Ken, and Bob wanted to harness it in a constructive way. Like that young man's art, he wanted to channel it into something healthy and positive. Humorist Stanley Bing once said, "Anger is a fuel. You need fuel to launch a rocket. But if all you have is fuel without any complex internal mechanism directing it, you don't have a rocket. You have a bomb." Bob encouraged Ken to join the football and wrestling teams, but only if he kept his grades up. Ken was always a natural athlete. At 14, he could bench 360 pounds. He was a star linebacker at school, specializing in sacking the quarterback. He had an eye for reading opposing offenses and anticipating what the next play would be.
Ken had grown a reputation around town, in the local area, as a gifted young athlete, but with the dark side. Despite pouring himself into sports, Ken still fought. He once was nearly expelled after a teammate laid a cheap shot on Ken during football practice. Ken got up and socked the boy in the face, took him down, and beat him until he was pulled off. As a senior, he was a team captain and all-league selection at linebacker. He went undefeated as a wrestler, qualifying for the state tournament. Before he could compete, though, tragedy struck. A freak accident in practice left Ken with a broken vertebrae in his neck. The doctors attached a halo device on his head and shoulders, partially immobilizing him. He wouldn't be allowed to play sports for a year, and contact sports were completely off limits, forever. Ken missed states, but otherwise, he wouldn't allow his injury to derail his athletics. Within a couple of months, he was seen on the basketball court, halo and all, boxing out opponents and skying for rebounds.
I was a lost kid, and then I was there for almost a year and a half at the home, and I felt like that was my home. There was 18 boys there, and 6 staff, and Bob and Dee Shamrock ran the home, and they lived there, so it wasn't house parents coming in and out, and it was a beautiful home, and I felt like I was their child, and so it was one of those things where I didn't want to leave. When my time was up, the state sent me home, and so I went home for, I don't know, it was the summer, I think it was, and school started up. I literally picked up the phone and called him and said, "Hey, I want to come back." And he said, "Okay, you open a bed up for me."
Bob had love for all the boys in his care, but a special bond grew with Ken. He was proud of him. He was given an untamed youth, like so many others, and Bob witnessed this boy grow into a man. He was a high school graduate, with college aspirations. He learned discipline, honor, and respect. Ken felt the world abandoned him, until Bob came into his life. Bob loved Ken like a son, something he and his wife Dee Dee could never have naturally, and longed for.
Yeah, I remember I was 16, I think. He wanted to adopt me, and my biological mother at the time, which I never really grew up with, I was in and out of the house and places and stuff, so I was never really there at all, and so I remember she refused to allow him to adopt me. So at 18 years old, I went ahead and did the adoption myself.
It was official. Kenneth Wayne Nance became Kenneth Wayne Shamrock.
Kenny played nose guard at Shasta Community College, where he earned all-league status and Defensive Most Valuable Player. His grades weren't that great, however, so the big four-year schools weren't calling. He was drafted by the Sacramento Bulldogs, a semi-pro team. It was a dead end, so he quit. Ken needed direction, and more importantly, money. Ken's reputation as a fighter landed him a job bouncing at a local bar. He moved to Reno and started bouncing clubs there. It was there that he met his first wife, Tina. He looked for cash wherever he can get it. He saw a flyer for a tough man competition and decided to enter. Ken won easily, earning him the nickname One Punch Shamrock and a cool $1,000.
Ken kept bouncing, and Reno's nightlife beckoned him. He'd stay up all night, drinking and partying, and sleep all day. He wanted to get back on track, so he joined the Marines. He enjoyed his time there, but was discharged after boot camp when evidence of his neck injury was found. Ken didn't know where to go next. He took a job at a youth center. On the weekends, he painted houses. He had no real job skills, but Bob knew his son was destined to become something great. One day, it came to him.
Bob grew up watching pro wrestling. He loved it, watching true shooters like Vernon and Lou Thesz on the single black and white television in his childhood home. Ken had the looks, charisma, and athleticism to be a great professional wrestler. Ken wasn't convinced at first, until he heard how much money could be made. Bob found a school in Sacramento, run by Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer. Ken quickly found out it wasn't much of a school. Buzz held tryouts in a dingy space for $250. He would work over the recruits until they quit. The sooner they did, the better. Ken wasn't built that way, as Buzz soon found out. He ended up giving Buzz a bit of his own medicine, despite not having wrestled since high school.
Buzz let Ken keep his tryout fee, and employed him as an enforcer in his scam. Instead of Buzz holding the tryouts, it was Ken. His job was to break the new recruits. For every non-refundable fee he kept, he threw a little Ken's way. Bob realized that the legendary wrestler wasn't much of a teacher. He took Ken out of the school. He found a legitimate gym in North Carolina. Ken was newly married, with a baby on the way. There was a lot of uncertainty, and Bob was established in California. Sacrifices needed to be made to give Ken a real opportunity for a career. Bob sold his home, and the Shamrocks moved to Mooresville, North Carolina.
After passing a tryout and the tuition paid, Ken began training in the art of professional wrestling. It usually took a student 2 years to complete the program, but it took Ken 4 months. He then got a gig with Old Japan Wrestling, cutting his teeth in the East for a month. It was a culture shock for Ken. He didn't understand the silent, respectful Japanese fans. He was trained to get the crowd to pop, but in Japan, they expressed that in a much more reserved fashion than here in the States. He had a hard time with the exotic food and living situation. Future teammate, Vernon White, felt a similar way when he competed there.
The people and how they treat you, they're way more respectful in Japan. But also, like, the streets, like when you're walking on the streets, these dudes will bump into you. And there's so many people there that they don't turn around and be like, hey, watch where you're going. They're more along the lines of, oh, sorry, trying to get to work. But they don't even say sorry. So, yeah, there's some culture shock there that if that would have happened here in America, I would have been like, hey, dude, you need to watch where you're going. To where in Japan, nobody cares.
Overall, it wasn't the best first impression. He returned to the U.S. and debuted in 1990 for the Atlantic Coast Wrestling promotion under the name Wayne Shamrock. Wrestling has always been huge in the South, and ACW wasn't the biggest promotion in the world, but garnered a nice following. Some fans took the show a little too seriously, and Ken realized that using his real name in the ring caused real-life problems at home. Fans would show up at his doorstep, angered over a particular storyline. They would get crazy phone calls. Once the ACW folded, South Atlantic Pro Wrestling began, and Ken changed his name to Vince Torelli. Later, he went heel as the villainous Mr. Wrestling.
Pro wrestling was a lot of work, but didn't pay much. In order to put food on the table for his young family, he found other ways to make some money. He found a couple more tough man contests, and won them. He also took street fights for cash, sometimes more than one in the same night. Ken continued to toil in SACW, and he eventually got an opportunity to do some house shows for the WWF. Ken trained hard, knowing this could be his one chance at the big time. Professional wrestling was an extremely tough profession, and it's based on trust. It's a bit like a dance, albeit a violent one. You can only be as good as your partner. You're trusting your partner to not hurt you, yet sell a believable contest. You trust your partner to have come prepared and perform at a high level. Unfortunately for Ken, he wasn't booked with the best dance partners, and his matches didn't impress the WWF enough to keep him.
He returned to SACW, and was contacted by his friend, fellow wrestler, Dean Malenko. Dean was in town on business, and Ken offered him a spare room in his home while he was there. Dean introduced him to the kind of wrestling he was performing in Japan, Universal Wrestling Federation, or UWF. Ken still had a bad taste in his mouth for Japan, so he didn't pay attention to the scene over there. When Dean showed him a tape, he was blown away. Unlike a typical match in the States, these guys were really going at it. They worked stiff, throwing hard strikes and using legit grappling and submission techniques. UWF wanted to be known as a more legit brand of wrestling than what fans were accustomed to. Although the outcomes were scripted and the moves weren't locked in, it still looked extremely real. Ken couldn't wait to get involved.
In 1991, Dean helped Ken get a tryout in Tampa with a man named Asumi Sammy Saranaka. Everything was on the line for Ken. He was a newlywed with a newborn baby, and Sammy stood between him and a real opportunity to provide for them. Under the hot Florida sun, Sammy put Ken through a brutal workout. Ken was still standing, unlike most of the potential recruits. Sammy then brought Ken into a gym and asked him to grapple with 3 assistants, each progressively tougher than the last. No breaks were given between each guy. Ken did well, but this wasn't a test of skill. This was a test of heart. Sammy was trying to get Ken to quit, but he refused. Once Ken defeated his third opponent, with no signs of slowing down, Sammy stopped the tryout. Ken went home to Mooresville, anxious to hear how he did. Finally, he got a call from Saranaka. Pack for Japan, he said.
Ken was eager to begin this new chapter in his life, but once he touched down in Tokyo, he found out that one more test awaited him. He went to the UWF dojo, and was put through yet another brutal tryout. It was 60 minutes of pure hell. He was matched against a young trainee, our young boy, for a 20-minute match. Ken's strength made up for his lack of technique, and he held his own. With no break, they swapped in another young boy, and Ken held him off for another 20 minutes. After that, the rookie stepped aside for a master, Minoru Suzuki. Suzuki would go on to have a legendary career in his own right, a master of catch wrestling and submission techniques. He humiliated Shamrock, submitting and choking him in every manner possible. After what seemed like forever, another master stepped in, Masakatsu Funaki. The embarrassment continued. Once the tryout was over, Ken slumped against the wall of the dojo, exhausted. Ken couldn't believe it. Was this how this was going to end? Doubt crept into his mind. Could he ever keep up with these guys? Finally, Funaki approached Ken to tell him he made it. He would stay in Japan and learn the art of submission fighting.
So I went back and trained a little bit. Funaki took me under his wing. Fujiwara taught me some. So I got to learn with a lot of guys right there at the beginning, and they respected me because I would never give up. So I got a lot of training and respect from them early on, and so I was able to pick their brain and learn from them, and that's what it was. Every day I'd go in and we'd eat, and we'd start doing training sessions. I worked out with the young guys and learned all the ankle locks and the submission holds, and the training, the squats, all that stuff. Worked with Carl Gotch for a while when he was up there. I got to learn from great guys. And that's what made me, I believe, made me a great fighter, was I was able to learn some really good submission guys.
He debuted for UWF later that year, defeating Yoji Anjo. Anjo had a big following in Japan, and to be put over by him was a huge deal, especially for a foreigner. After a second match with Funaki, UWF folded. The company split into 3 different promotions. Ken went to Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi, due to his relationship with Fujiwara and Saranaka. Ken continued his career, and his popularity in Japan skyrocketed. He was on the covers of local magazines and billboards. Crowds chanted his name at shows. All the while, Ken trained with Funaki, developing the fighting style he would showcase for decades to come. He traveled back and forth from Japan and the US. He left early for scheduled shows, and stayed after they were over to keep training. Fujiwara Gumi was another shoot-style promotion, with predetermined outcomes. However, back at the gym, the bouts were decidedly more real. More than once, Ken was challenged by his fellow wrestlers to a real shoot match. Whoever won would be put over during the match on the show.
Ken loved professional wrestling, but always wanted to test himself in a real contest. On October 4th, 1992, he got the chance. Fujiwara Gumi booked a match the likes of which the Japanese fans had never seen before. Shamrock was to face Muay Thai champion Don Nakaya Nielsen in a true fight. Nielsen was popular in Japan, feuding with professional wrestlers like Fujiwara over the legitimacy of their craft. The bout was heavily hyped, and Nielsen was just as sharp with his trash talk as he was with his elbows. 40,000 fans packed the Tokyo Dome. Grappling versus striking. No one knew what to expect, but Ken was confident. He knew Nielsen had no chance if they went to the ground, and had no problem taking a few blows to get there. Ken was born with his fists up. Since birth, he bit down his mouthpiece, brawled, and survived.
Nielsen opened the bout with a kick, which Ken avoided to score a takedown. He quickly transitioned to a key lock, submitting the kickboxer in 45 seconds. The crowd exploded. They didn't know what to expect, but they loved what they saw. Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki took note. People would pay to see this. There was no need to wrap the product with colorful robes, laser lights, and gimmicks. People went to shows like Fujiwara Gumi because they showcased legit athletes with skills. Why cloud the outcome? Why not take it all the way? In a bold move, Suzuki and Funaki broke away from Fujiwara to form Pancras Hybrid Wrestling.
Pancras would feature real bouts, with rules based on pro wrestling. No close fist strikes to the head were allowed, nor were elbows of any kind. Fighters were allowed 5 rope breaks. Just like in a pro wrestling match, if a person caught in a submission could touch a rope, the referee would break the hold. Pancras was literally stiff-style wrestling, without the script. They needed a star to bank on, and Ken was their first choice. He was white hot in Japan at the time, and having him on a card would be huge. It was a gamble. If Ken went to Pancras and it failed, it might ruin his professional wrestling career. But Ken was a loyal guy. He developed a strong friendship with Funaki under his tutelage, and knew he wouldn't have gotten anywhere without him. He decided to join his instructor in his new endeavor.
The Shamrocks moved back to California, buying a home in Lodi. For his professional wrestling career, Ken shared time in Japan and the States, training sporadically in the East. To be successful in Pancras, Ken had to take his training to the next level. He needed to be able to train more often and at home. He tried looking up local dojos. Nobody was interested in the intense young man at their doorstep, looking for partners to help train for some Japanese blood sport. He stopped looking for training partners and started building them instead. Ken put the word out and started training students in his attic. They attracted more fighters, like Vernon White.
Yeah, I met a dude out in Angels Camp, California, and his name was, they called him Papa John. He ran a boys' home, and he knew Bob, and so he introduced me to Bob on the phone, and then Bob told me about Ken, and I went down to the Lions, before it was even called the Lions Den, I went down to Ken's gym and did my little initiation. He kicked my butt for half an hour, and then I was in.
It didn't take very long to grow out of it. He opened a small space in a local strip mall. It needed a name. He didn't want it to be confused as just another karate studio. One night, he watched a National Geographic documentary on lions. He watched how the lions, the top of the food chain, worked together as a cohesive team. They hunted for food and protected themselves as a unit, a family. It spoke of the lion's home, the lion's den. It was a perfect fit. Ken Shamrock made his true mixed martial arts debut at Pancras 1, Yes, We Are Hybrid Wrestlers, on September 21st, 1993. The main card consisted of 5 bouts, each one round of 15 minutes. Pancras 1 also featured the MMA debuts of fellow Lions Den member Vernon Tiger White and future UFC Hall of Famer Bas Rutten. Ken was paired in the main event against none other than Matsukatsu Funaki. Having trained together for years, both men were extremely familiar with one another. Funaki was the main reason Ken was in the position he was in, and he had a lot of respect for his instructor. He was at the doorstep of something huge, but he had to get through his friend to get there. In order to honor him, he couldn't hold back.
I look at the situation, and he's on the other side of the ring, and that he's there to do the same thing that I'm there to do, and that is to try to win. And if I don't do that, then I disrespect him. All the training that he put into me, all the time that and his effort and his trust that he put into me goes out the door if I don't go in and give him my best.
Both men exchanged strikes, but soon enough they hit the ground. Instructor and student exchanged leg submission attempts. Recognizing the stalemate, the referee stood the men back up. Funaki tried to shoot for a takedown off of the break, but Ken quickly reversed the position and ended up in the mount. Ken cross-faced Funaki and transitioned into an arm triangle choke. At 6 minutes 15 seconds, Funaki tapped. Ken jumped in the air and screamed. He continued celebrating while Funaki recovered. Funaki stood back up, and both men shook hands in the center of the ring. The show was a huge success, and a month later Pancras held their second show. Ken was back in the main event. This time was against Kazuyo Takahashi. It took twice as long as his last fight, but the results were the same. He finished Takahashi in 12 minutes 23 seconds by heel hook.
Pancras was growing faster than the owners expected. It was the biggest show on the island. They needed fighters, especially foreigners, in order to diversify their cards. Ken brought in Vernon, and Pancras asked him if he could help get more. Ken agreed, but only if they were properly prepared. He wasn't going to send people overseas to embarrass themselves. He needed more room than the simple storefront could provide. He sold it, and bought a large space in a warehouse district of Lodi. He outfitted it as a complete training center, with a weight room, mats, and heavy bags. The new and improved Lions Den was ahead of its time. This was a facility in the business of creating fighters. Vernon White remembered that time.
Yeah, I remember when we got a 100% sponsorship from Hammer Strength, and we were actually the only quasi-semi-fighter gym at that time, so we had 13 pieces of Hammer Strength equipment, which was unknown in any place in California, or I think even in the United States at that time, from what I remember hearing Ken say. So we had stuff that, like, people are, oh man, that's cool, I wish we had that at our gym. And and it blossomed from there. Then we started getting people in like Guy Mesger and Trey Telligman and dudes like that.
In order to join the Lions Den, you didn't just walk through the door and apply. Ken held tryouts, just like the kind he experienced when joining UWF. Potential recruits were put through a rigorous exercise test. If anyone survived, they were thrown on the mats. Ken would handle that part personally, just like how Funaki did in the UWF dojo. Very few made it. The Lions Den trials have lived on in infamy for their brutal nature.
To this day, probably I haven't seen anything as brutal as Lions Den initiations.
Jason DeLucia.
And that's just the way it was. That was old school, and that was something, I think, just as a tradition going through pro wrestling. That's the way they did it, from Bart Vale to Fujiwara to, Funaki, all those guys. That was their initiation. You beat the shit out of these guys just to show that they had the heart to make it. And it was traumatizing. Well, no, it was enlightening.
Jerry Bohlander described the aftermath.
There had been guys that passed out. We didn't have a cage or a mat at the time. We actually had a boxing ring with a little piece of carpet pad on top of a concrete floor. So the takedowns and the grappling wasn't too nice, but that's what we had. I've seen people puke. I've seen people pass out, and not just by getting necked out, passed out just from hyperventilation, just straight up give up.
Those that were chosen had their heads shaved and were put in Ken's home. He provided food, lodging, and all the training a fighter would need. In exchange, Ken would take a percentage of the fighter's earnings. A typical training day was merciless, as Vernon explains.
Like I said, in the beginning, we were just doing our boxing, kickboxing, grappling, and then we'd have to do 500 push-ups, sit-ups, leg lifts, and squats every other day. And then Ken was like, look, okay, now we're going to go to the gym. Now we're going to do road work. And that's when things got crazy, is when we started doing road work and running. In Lodi, it gets hot in the summer, and it gets cold in the winter because we're real close to the foothills. It kind of sucked there. We had no heating, no air conditioning. So anybody who wanted to be there was serious.
Ken trained his students like he was, in the traditional Japanese style. Jerry Bohlander gave us an example.
His coaching was based on the Japanese style of coaching. There's nothing nice about it. Trial by fire. We would, just one of the ways to toughen us up, callousing sessions. The callousing session was basically Ken grabbing various leg submissions on you for about 30 minutes straight and making you scream. And Ken was good enough with those leg submissions that he knew the point, that fine line between injury or pain and injury. So he would keep you in that pain, right at that pain threshold for about 30 minutes, just switching up submissions and just to toughen you up. I think it did toughen us up. I mean, I was pretty well pain inoculated by the time we got done with that. When he would get in there and roll with us, it wasn't a nurturing fashion. He'd get in there and he'd just crush us. So we learned, like I said, trial by fire. I know that I improved in that manner. Some people it didn't work for very well. They weren't as mentally tough.
He was traditional, but for his team, he nixed some of the formalities. There would be no bowing. He wouldn't be called master. Vernon told us about Ken's coaching style.
If you weren't doing it right, he's going to let you know. If you're doing things good, he would just smile and nod his head. We never really got any high praise from him because I don't believe that I don't think he knew how to express that without seeming soft. So everything with Ken was rough, gruff exterior, and that's how we're going to keep it because that's what I know.
Jason DeLucia went further.
He didn't tolerate bad attitude. In other words, you have to be humble in the dojo, and you have to know where your place is and don't overstep it because it's a house of pain. There's a reality that goes with what you do. And I have seen him on more than one occasion exemplify that teaching by basically karmic retribution. You mess around, you get hurt. There was no question in anybody's mind that Ken was the man in the dojo. You could get lucky on a day and look what I did. But in general, if you said nine times out of 10, what's going to happen in this fight, there's no question, and nobody ever said anything. Jerry
Bohlander summed it up.
We just went in there and we made sure that we were going to win by beating the shit out of each other. And it was, if you could survive our training, then you could survive any fight. You weren't gonna see us out there tapping out or giving up. It was we just mentally and physically calloused one another. I mean, looking back, nowadays you look at it and go, "What the fuck? That's some stupid training." But nobody knew any better back then. We were developing the training systems. They hadn't been developed yet. The guys nowadays have, God, they have so much going for them just because most of the mistakes that can be made have already been made.
Sometime in 1993, one of Ken's students, Scott Pasak, showed him an advertisement in Black Belt magazine for a new show in the United States, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. They were looking for fighters to compete in a new tournament-style event. There would be no weight limit, no time limit, and no rules. Ken was initially skeptical. He heard of similar events, but none of them ever materialized. After a few phone calls, he found out how real it was and signed up. He still wasn't completely convinced the show would go off. So much so, he agreed to fight Takaku Fouquet at Pancras 3 a few days before the event. After defeating Fouquet by a rear naked choke in 44 seconds, he jumped on a plane to Denver, Colorado. The very first Ultimate Fighting Championship was held at McNichols Sports Arena on November 12, 1993. It featured a field of fighters from all walks of life, representing different disciplines.
I mean, I'm looking around the room and I'm going, dude, this is a joke. You got guys that look like they just got up the bar stool. You got some guys that look like, okay, yeah, I know that guy. He's a badass, which is Gerard Godot. So there's a few of them there that I was like, okay, those are the guys that I got to look out for.
There were kickboxers, karate men, even a sumo. Ken wasn't the only grappler on the card. A man named Royce Gracie, one of the smallest men in the tournament, represented his family style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
And then I saw Royce was in pajamas walking around, which was a gi, but to me it looked like pajamas. He's strutting around in them while everybody's wearing their clothes. So I'm just kind of like, dude, this is a circus, man.
Ken had only passing knowledge of the Gracies at that point. Before agreeing to fight in the UFC, Ken did his homework. Pancras didn't want one of their star fighters to go to another organization and lose. Ken found out that UFC was co-founded by Rorion Gracie, Royce's brother. Ken watched tape on Royce, and his grappling skill was obvious, but overall he didn't impress Ken. Prior to the event, there was a rules meeting. UFC was being promoted as a contest with no rules, but there were in fact two: no biting and no eye gouging. For some reason, Ken was not allowed to wear his wrestling shoes. It struck Ken as odd. Wasn't this supposed to be no rules? Art Jimerson, a boxer, was allowed to wear a glove. Why couldn't Ken wear his shoes? He pushed it from his mind. This tournament was his for the taking. Ken took us back to the locker room, just prior to the first bout in UFC history.
And I remember the very first fight was Gerard Godot, which I knew was a badass, and this big old sumo, which I also knew was a badass. And so the fight starts, and everybody's in the locker rooms. They're popping pads, and the adrenaline's really high, right? And the crowd doesn't quite know what to expect. They just see these two guys in the ring. Fight starts, Gerard just hops across the ring, and the big old sumo guy comes pounding out. Leg kicks him, throws a punch, guy goes down, and then he walks over and football kicks him in the face. That just happened. That was reality, man. We never saw this, man. Like, none of this stuff was like, you don't see this except in the Street Fighter or on TV. And so all of a sudden the crowd just went quiet. And it was like, dude, the crowd couldn't process it that fast enough. Like, that was real. Like, this, like, how do you fake that? And so the locker room gets quiet, and the whole place seemed like it just went silent for about 10 seconds. It was like a split second. I was saying here, Super Bowl, he just can't fly in the front row. The crowd went nuts, and the guys in the locker room were like, dude, I didn't sign up for this. And I was like, yeah, we did. We just didn't know it looked like that. But this is as real as it gets right here.
Ken entered his first match with kickboxer Patrick Smith. Pat entered the cage at 6'2", 225 pounds, and the number one ranked super heavyweight kickboxer in the U.S. The matchup reminded Ken of his bout with Don Akaya Nilsson. Pat clearly looked the part and was very dangerous standing up, but Ken doubted he had anything when it came to ground fighting. Just like in the Nilsson fight, Pat opened with a kick which Ken blocked. He then closed the distance, wrapped Pat in a body lock, throwing him to the ground. Ken worked from the top position, looking to break Pat's grip on his head. Once he did, Ken dove back onto Pat's leg. Ken submitted Smith via heel hook at 1 minute, 49 seconds. Pat was the hometown favorite, and Ken's quick work upset the crowd. They were ignorant to the submission arts, and didn't understand the type of hold Ken had used was extremely dangerous.
Because they just didn't understand it. They spit on me, and they threw beer on me after I heel hooked Patrick Smith. They had no understanding about what we were doing.
It was a crazy scene. Jason DeLucia fought in an alternate bout, and was very familiar.
That was the first time I was ever in an arena for a professional event, and that was pretty astounding, especially that I'd never seen things like what we saw. Was The crowd was crazy and drunk and throwing stuff at the ring and at the fighters as they entered, and it was traumatizing to me at the time. I was kind of disgusted, actually.
In the semifinals, he faced Royce. Ken's confidence was through the roof. In his mind, he already defeated the most dangerous guy in the tournament, easily at that. The bell sounded, and Royce quickly dove for a takedown, which Ken defended, slipping in 2 underhooks. He tried to step over Royce to mount him, but Royce scrambled back to his feet to escape. Royce then tried to pull guard and drag Ken to the mat. Ken posted up and tried to drop back onto Royce's leg, like he had done to Pat Smith. Royce was too crafty for that. He used his gi to defend the submission attempt, and used the leverage he generated to reverse the position. Royce then utilized his gi sleeve to lock in a modified rear naked choke. In less than a minute, it was over.
Ken showed class in defeat. In fact, the referee missed Ken's initial tap and urged the fighters to continue. Ken declined, knowing that wouldn't be the honorable thing to do. The loss ate him up inside. He blamed himself. He wasn't prepared to fight a man in a gi. He underestimated the Brazilian. He swore he'd have his revenge. A fabled rivalry was born. Royce went on to win UFC 1, and Ken returned to the Lion's Den. The rematch with Royce consumed him. He studied the history of the Gracies, attended a jiu-jitsu academy in LA, and dressed all of his training partners in gi tops. He was impressed by the Gracie tradition, but at no point did he feel they were invincible. When he bolted down, he saw some chinks in the armor. He didn't think Royce liked to get hit. It seemed he did everything in his power to avoid striking at all costs. Moreover, he saw jiu-jitsu as an opportunistic style that capitalized on your opponent's mistakes. If none presented themselves, Ken felt Royce was helpless. Lastly, the gi. As much as it is a benefit for the jiu-jitsu practitioner, creating friction and drawing perspiration, it can also be used against the wearer. Fighting in a gi for a long period of time will wear a user out quicker than one who does not. UFC 2 is scheduled for March. He'll be ready.
Ken returned to the Pancras ring in December, defeating Andre Van Den Otelar by heel hook in a minute. After he suffered his first Pancras loss to Suzuki in January, he focused his attention on the UFC. No quick Pancras match before the event this time. Ken was feeling great, but 3 weeks before the event, he blocked a kick in training and broke his hand. Royce saluted him once again and went on to win UFC 2. By April 1994, he was well enough to compete again, and continued to fight in Pancras. He went on a 3-fight win streak, defeating the likes of Ryushi Yanagasawa, Matt Hume, and Bas Rutten, all by submission. In September, Shamrock faced Funaki in a rematch. This time, Funaki got the better of Ken, defeating him via rear naked choke in 2 minutes 30 seconds.
A week later, he returned to the octagon for UFC 3. The event was growing in popularity, and this time the promoters had a true grudge match to sell. Ken vs. Royce was the storyline everyone was paying to see. Both men were placed on opposite ends of the bracket, and were the odds-on favorites to meet in the final. In Ken's first fight, he fought Christoph Lineker, a judoka. He dispatched the Olympian in less than 5 minutes, using a barrage of punches and headbutts to force a tap-out. In the semifinals, he defeated kickboxer Felix Mitchell by rear naked choke, but tweaked his knee. It hurt, but he was on a roll, salivating for his revenge. Royce was having a hard time, however. He took on Kimo Leopoldo in the opening round, and although Royce won, he was battered.
And I literally dominated my guys, but like I said, I wanted Royce. And so coming out, when I went after Royce, I wasn't there for anything else but him. I'm waiting for him, and I'm all excited because this is the moment I was waiting for, to be able to go in there and be able to beat him without having a disadvantage. And he doesn't come out. He doesn't come out to fight. And I kept asking, what's the problem? Why won't he come fight? And you know what they said? He was exhausted. He was exhausted. I was like, everybody's exhausted. How do you now go in and fight somebody because you're exhausted? You got time to rest. And I was so pissed off.
He had to drop out of the tournament, and was replaced by an alternate. When Ken found out, he was furious. He came here for one reason and one reason only, to defeat Royce Gracie. With that escaping him, and his knee hurt, he decided to quit. He forfeited the final match to Steve Jenham, the man who subbed for Royce, making him the most dubious UFC champion in history. Bob was furious with Ken over the decision. In his book, Beyond the Lion's Den, he wrote, "He knew why I had done it, that I didn't care about the money or the belt, but he felt that I let my fans down. I suppose I did in a way, but revenge is a funny thing. It blinds you to everything else.
Ken turned the page, defeating Takaku Fuke and Pancras by rear naked choke a month later. UFC 4 was being booked for December, but instead of joining, Ken entered the prestigious King of Pancras tournament. To crown their first champion, Pancras set up a 2-day, 16-man tournament. It was a stacked bracket, featuring all the top fighters from the organization. In the opening round, Ken defeated Alex Cook and Maurice Smith by submissions to qualify for Day 2. In the semifinals, he faced Funaki for the third time. Ken was victorious in the rubber match, submitting him with an arm triangle choke at 5 minutes 50 seconds. In the finals, he faced Manabo Yamada. Ken attempted multiple submissions on the man known as Oyaban, or Kingpin. He was tough and weathered it all. In the end, the match went the entire 30-minute time frame, and Ken was declared the winner by unanimous decision. Ken Shamrock was crowned the first King of Pancras, and with that, became the first foreign champion in MMA history in Japan. It was a huge moment.
Oh, it was, hey, listen, that don't happen, right? I mean, you don't get to go over in the very first tournament, very first time they ever put a belt on somebody in an organization, and it's a gaijin, it's a foreigner that wins it. So I'm pretty sure that's not what they expected to happen, but I was definitely honored to be the guy that did it. So it was a high, that it was something you could never, ever, it's just something that's an experience that you'll never forget.
Ken was a champion fighter, but he also led a championship team.
When I train somebody, I want them sooner or later for them to be able to beat me, for their floor to be my ceiling. That's what I'm at. I want their ceiling to be so much higher, because that's what I'm there for. If I'm training somebody, I'm putting effort into them, I don't want them not to be good. I want to be great.
The pipeline between Lions Den and Pancras proved fruitful for both sides, granting more opportunities to the Californian stable. At one point, 7 out of the top 10 fighters in Pancras were Lions Den members. The Lions Den produced many champions for not only Pancras, but other organizations as well.
Frank, Ken's adopted brother, became King of Pancras after only a year of training at Lions Den. He went on to have a legendary career as a UFC, Strikeforce, and WEC champion. Guy Mezger became the 7th King of Pancras, UFC 13 tournament winner, and a star for Pride Fighting Championships. Vernon White became the King of the Cage middleweight champion, and IFC heavyweight champion. Maurice Smith won the UFC heavyweight belt in 1997 and was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Jerry Bohlander won the UFC 12 tournament. He told us the impact Ken had on his life, and others.
Ken gave me an opportunity that I never would have had. Had it not been Ken, I wouldn't have had that opportunity. I was in line to get in a lot of trouble, doing a lot of drinking, getting in fights every friggin' weekend, just doing some stupid shit. And then when I met Ken, I stopped everything. Prior to that, I was in dozens that year alone. I was going to probably end up in prison and a career criminal like most of the people in my family. So, Ken gave me an opportunity that I could never thank him enough for. Like I said, there's a number of us even that probably just would have went so far the wrong way had it not been for that opportunity. As tough and as intense and as mean as he may have been, it was all worth it. I'm in a good place now, and I give all the credit in the world to Ken for that.
Ken's visage was everywhere in Japan, from comic books to t-shirts to video games. After his tournament victory, he went on to defeat Leon Deke via heel hook and defend his title against Bas Rutten. Ken defeated Bas for the second time, submitting him by knee bar in a minute. Despite his success, he still had an unfulfilled vendetta back home. He conquered the East, but he wouldn't be satisfied until he vanquished Gracie and took home a UFC championship. The fans were impatient too, and UFC set up their first Super Fight Championship. It would allow the UFC to promote a guaranteed marquee matchup, without the risk of losing it in a tournament format. The tournaments wouldn't go away. Instead, would be used as a way to challenge the Super Fight champion.
The inaugural Super Fight Championship between Royce and Ken took place as the main event of UFC 5. The event was held in Charlotte, North Carolina on April 7th, 1995. Dan Severn, returning from his UFC 4 loss to Gracie in the finals, went on to win the tournament. Just prior to the start of the event, Royce and Ken were told their match would have a 30-minute time limit. Both men were upset by this rule change. For Royce, A time limit was contrary to the philosophy of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. A true contest should have no limits. You go until there is a winner. For Ken, it put a monkey wrench into his game plan.
30 minutes is not long. I mean, most people are like, dude, that's a long fight. But it's not for Royce. It's not for me. Because my strategy was to wear him out to prove that he's not the best conditioned athlete like they were bragging about, and that their submissions are the best. And so my idea was to wear him out so he can't lift his legs, he can't lift his arms, and then submit him.
The Lions Den always prepared for long fights. Jason DeLucia explains.
When you're dealing with somebody who's a professional fighter, which he was a professional fighter, you have to dispel a lot of your romantic notions about your art. So, like, the first thing that you learn is conditioning is your number one hold. You say, okay, well, what's conditioning? You say, well, you got to lift weights in the morning, which was enough workout for me because I was not a huge weightlifter. I lifted weights, but not like he did. And then after lifting, you had to do conditioning. Well, to me, they were the same thing. He's like, no, one is resistance with weights, and the other is you got to be able to do 500 squats, 500 push-ups, 500 leg lifts, 500. And then when you're done, then you got to wrestle. Are you kidding?
Unfortunately, matches on pay-per-view can't go on infinitely. Management botched UFC 4, having not purchased enough time for the Gracie vs. 7 final. As Gracie and Dan played chess in the corner of the cage, the broadcast cut off. Fans sued, refunds were given, and it was a huge mess. There was no way they were going to allow that again.
Both men protested, but went ahead with the bout. The time limit changed Ken's game plan, but he had to remember to stay patient. He had to be methodical, and wear Royce down without exposing himself. He took Royce down within the first minute. After a brief scramble, Ken settled into Royce's guard for the remainder of the 30-minute period. Gracie used his patented heel strikes to Ken's kidneys, and attacked his neck with his gi sleeve. Ken peppered Royce with body shots, palm strikes, and headbutts. At the end of 31 minutes, the fighters were restarted on their feet for a 5-minute overtime. Once they restarted, Ken blasted Royce with a right hook, swallowing his eye. The match went to the ground soon after, and Ken continued deliberately working over Gracie from the top position. When time ran out, the match was declared a draw, since no judges were in place. Despite that, the feeling was that Ken won the match. He controlled the majority of the bout, and did far more damage in what became the longest match in UFC history.
And unfortunately, when they put that timer in there, it just wasn't enough time to do that. I mean, as you saw, if anybody watched the fight, if it would have went the way I wanted it to go and the way they were supposed to go, Royce wouldn't have made it out of that fight. Royce would have been too exhausted even already, even with the 36 minutes. He was already hard enough to even get up and get out of the ring. His brothers had to help him. So the strategy that I had set in place would have worked. Unfortunately, they were saved by the bell.
A month later, Ken lost his King of Pancras title to Minoru Suzuki at Eyes of the Beast 4. Royce and his brother Horan did not like the new restrictions being put on the sport. Horan sold his share of the company, and Royce left the organization. The Superfight belt still needed to be crowned, so instead of Shamrock vs. Gracie 3, they matched him against the UFC 5 tournament winner, Dan Severn. Dan, the Beast Severn, put wrestling on the map in the octagon. An accomplished amateur and international wrestler, Dan made his debut at UFC 4, suplexing Anthony Macias into oblivion. He was powerful and a huge individual, coming in at 6'2", 260 pounds. Many fans looked to him as the favorite.
The bout took place at UFC 6, Clash of the Titans. Ken's career can be defined by his rivalries. He closed the book on Gracie, for now, and he began another with the hulking wrestler from Coldwater, Michigan. Ken heard of Dan years earlier, when he sent Ken a videotape.
I remembered Dan sent me a tryout tape, and he basically sent me this tape because he wanted to come try out, be in the Lions Den, but he wanted to have his own. He wanted to stay at home and do it. And he showed me this videotape where he was just beating up on this dummy. And so I just really threw it aside because I didn't think anything of it. I was like, whatever, this dude's crazy. If he thinks he's not going to come try out.
The night before the fight, the fighters were brought into a hall for a media session.
And I remember we had sat down, we were doing this press conference in a small room, and there was very few reporters let in. There was probably about 3 or 4 in this room. And Dan was sitting at one end of the table, and I was sitting at the other end, and the reporters were in the middle. So they start firing questions off. Well, all the questions are directed at me, right? And so this went on for about 10 minutes, and Dan gets up and walks out of the room. I stood up, and I said, what are you doing? He goes, he just walked out, didn't say anything. I go, you know what? And as Phyllis was walking by, she got up too. I said, you know what? I was just going to beat him, but now I'm going to hurt him. And she looked at, she goes, oh, you wish. And she came at me harder than he did. I was like, you think she's not fighting?
Ken recognized Dan's strength and skill, but in studying his opponent, he found a weakness. Dan left his neck open when shooting for a takedown, making him susceptible to a guillotine choke. When the bout began, it didn't take long for the opportunity to present itself. After tying up, Dan dropped into a single leg attempt. Ken tried for the guillotine choke, but Dan powered his way out. Soon after, Dan dropped for another takedown, this time a double leg, and Ken looked to apply the choke again. He locked his hands and pushed Dan to the mat, multiplying the pressure. Dan tapped out at 2 minutes 14 seconds. Ken Shamrock became the UFC's first super fight champion.
For the next year, Ken went 4-1 between UFC title defenses and Pancras bouts. He fought Oleg Taktarov to a draw at UFC 7, and he submitted Chemo by knee bar at UFC 8. All the while, Severn made a case for a rematch. He wanted Ken's belt, and in order to get that chance, he competed in UFC's first super tournament, Ultimate 95. It was a tournament comprised of past winners and runners-up. Dan defeated Paul Varlins, Tank Abbott, and Oleg Taktarov to win the title and a shot at Shamrock. Politics continued to weigh down the UFC. Senator John McCain made the banning of mixed martial arts in America one of his primary platforms. He nearly succeeded, forcing rule changes and cable networks to abandon the lucrative program. These outside forces contributed to one of the most infamous events in UFC history.
UFC 9, Motor City Madness, was held on May 17, 1996, in Detroit, Michigan. Ken was in enemy territory. Dan grew up in Michigan, and the crowd would be hostile. Not only that, but ongoing legal proceedings with the state of Michigan, promoted by Mr. McCain, caused several changes to the show, several of which at the last minute. For the first time, there would be no tournament. For UFC 9, all of the fighters competed in single matches, like a standard boxing card. In addition, closed fist strikes and headbutts were not allowed. The state of Michigan went so far as to say should any fighter break these rules, the fighter would be arrested right on the spot. Apparently, a local show was shut down for ignoring these stipulations only a couple of weeks before.
When they told Ken the news, merely 2 hours before the event, he considered canceling. The rule changes were being told to him with a wink, so to speak. It was made clear, without explicitly saying, that the rules were being changed, but not enforced. Essentially, they are fulfilling their obligation to the state by informing the fighters. Ken looked at the bigger picture. He prided himself on being a role model. Throughout his career, he made time for community service in the cities he was in. He would donate to a local Boys and Girls Club.
I had a group home where I was raising boys, juvenile boys. And the one thing that I preached to them, the same thing that was preached to me when I was young, stay within the rules. You'll achieve whatever you want. He said, but when you cross over, you can't come back. And there's no excuse. And so you stay within those rules and you can reach the levels you want to reach. So I preached that, I lived that, and when I was in that fight, there was no way I was going to break it.
Ken grew up ignoring the rules, and it cost him. Now, his employer, the company he represented as champion, was asking him to ignore the law. He thought back to UFC 3. He didn't want to disappoint his fans, so he agreed to fight, but he would do it his way. Ken would win within the rules. In fact, these new rules sounded more like Pancras than UFC, so it was an easy transition in his mind.
Ken walked to the octagon under a hail of booze, throwing drinks and profanity. When they announced Severn, he raised his hands to the sky, and the sellout crowd boomed. Then the two began what became known as the Dance in Detroit. For the majority of 30 minutes, a 20-minute regulation round, and 2 overtimes of 5 minutes, Dan circled Ken. There was so little action, fans started throwing food and beer into the octagon. At one point, late in the fight, Dan opened up and cracked Ken in the face, drawing blood. Dan went on to win via split decision. Ken had no regrets.
I had plenty of time, opportunities to smash him, and I didn't, because I knew by doing that I would break my code. And my code was teaching other people, stay within the rules. Even though someone tells you you can break them, that don't make it right.
Ken wanted the chance to redeem himself and get another shot at Severn. In November, UFC held its second super tournament, Ultimate 96. He trained for months in preparation. He spent time in Cincinnati, training with the Bengals' strength and conditioning coach, Kevin Woods. He had a singular focus and ignored requests from Pancras to fight. He wanted to prove that he was still the best in UFC. He wanted to be champion again. Ken's first bout was against Brian Johnston. With Johnston, you were already seeing how fighters were adapting to MMA. Bryan was competent in wrestling and was a Golden Gloves champion in boxing. Ken began the match, exploding into a double leg. He took Johnston down, pinning him into the corner of the fence. Ken unleashed devastating ground and pound. During the barrage, he felt something snap in his hand. With the crowd chanting his name, Ken applied a forearm choke and got the submission. When he got backstage, the doctors determined he broke his hand, the same one that caused him to bow out of UFC 2. He wouldn't be allowed to continue in the tournament.
Ken let his hand heal and took stock. His singular focus on the Ultimate 96 cost him his Pancras contract. Not only that, but Pancras cut all of the Lion's Den fighters out of their organization. To make matters worse, his contract was up in the UFC, and he was told he had to take a significant pay cut in order to stay on the roster. It wasn't as if Ken's popularity was fading, far from it. But the bottom line was the UFC wasn't making any money at the time. They were having a hard time getting on pay-per-view, fighting against a political agenda. Ken came to the conclusion that he needed a break. He was burnt out, and his level of sacrifice far outweighed the financial gains. He went back to where it all started, pro wrestling.
Ken Shamrock, now billed as the world's most dangerous man, made his WWF debut on February 24th, 1997, on Monday Night Raw. A month later, he refereed a match between Bret the Hitman Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin at WrestleMania 13. His first actual match was against Vernon Tiger White.
No one wanted to work with Ken because they were afraid he was stiff and he was going to hurt people, and that was true because I ended up with 7 stitches in my forehead after that show. It was fun. They actually had to edit out the blood squirting out of my forehead during the match.
For the next 2 years, Ken had a successful run with the company. Using his patented ankle lock finishing hold, Ken would go on to win the 1998 King of the Ring, the Intercontinental title, and the Tag Team Championship with his partner, Big Boss Man. He was only there a short time, but made a huge impact. He was just as big as anyone during the Attitude Era. In 1999, he was released from the company after Ken injured his neck in a match with Chris Jericho and Curtis Hughes. Thanks to the WWF, Ken was a big draw, but on a personal level, he was having a lot of difficulty. You're on the road a lot as a professional wrestler, and his marriage was in tatters. Not only that, he needed money. The people he trusted with his finances failed him. He always wanted to return to MMA, but he wanted time to heal and shake off the rust. With the bills looming, he had to jump right back in. Pride Fighting Championships in Japan was becoming the largest MMA promotion in the world. They had a huge budget, paid fighters well, and put on highly produced shows to pack Japanese crowds. To celebrate the millennium, Pride organized their first tournament. The finals of Pride Grand Prix 2000 will be the first U.S. television broadcast for the company. In order to make the show more appealing to the American audience, they booked Ken in a super fight against Alexander Otsuka.
His comeback to MMA was a successful one. He knocked out Otsuka in 9 minutes 43 seconds, the first of his career. He returned for Pride 10 and faced the tough Kazuyuki Fujita, known for his granite chin. Fujita went by the name Ironhead. Early in the fight, Ken was game, but was noticeably smaller than when he fought Otsuka. His personal life made it impossible for him to train properly. He was going through a divorce and sharing custody with his children. The stress ate away at him. At about midway through the first round, Ken hit a wall. He was extremely fatigued, to the point where he felt like he was going to have a heart attack. He asked for his corner to throw in the towel. It was discovered backstage that Ken was having heart palpitations. Ken was scheduled to fight Igor Vovchanchyn at Pride 13, but re-injured his neck and blew an ACL in training. He returned to action on August 10, 2001, submitting Sam Atkins at WMMA 1, winning a title in the process.
He returned to Pride to fight Don Frye at Pride 19, Bad Blood. It was aptly titled. The build-up to this fight was intense. At first, Don attacked Ken's pride, saying he ducked him at Ultimate 96, the tournament where Ken broke his hand and Don went on to win. Then he got personal, accusing Ken of cheating on his ex-wife when he was still married. Frye didn't stop there, telling reporters that Frank and his dad, who were currently not speaking to Ken, would be in his corner for the bout. Ken wanted to make Don pay for crossing the line.
The fight began with one of the most intense stare-downs in combat sports history.
Did you know that Ken was going to come out and stare it down like that? Were you expecting that out of him?
Yeah, because I know he hated my guts, you know. I expected that because, you know, I was just an asshole throughout the whole time. You know, we did a media tour. We went to L.A. and Detroit, and a couple other places. Phoenix, and I said some stuff I shouldn't have said, and because you gotta get Ken mad. You get Ken mad, he quits thinking. He just wants to kill. He wanted to kill me, that's for sure, and I deserved it.
When the bell sounded, they went right at it and exchanged body blows. It was an extremely action-packed, close fight, with Ken threatening Don with leg locks on multiple occasions. Don knew he was going up against a leg submission expert, and tried to protect himself beforehand, but it backfired, as Ken explains.
Don and his people there, they taped his ankles like a cast. The only problem, though, was when you do that ankle lock, if the ankle doesn't give, then your knee gives. And so that's why he sustained so much damage when he taped his ankles, because the ankle would probably heal a lot better, but he tore a lot of ligaments when I did that, because the ankle didn't go all the way through. It actually went all the way up into his knee. So that's why he sustained so much damage, and that's why he was never the same again after that fight.
In the third, Don dropped Ken with a left hook, but couldn't finish it. The end of the fight locked together, exchanging leg submissions. It was an amazing performance for both men, and Don was given a split decision win. After the bout, Don apologized for his actions. He had no excuse. He did what he had to do to get the fight. Ken reflected on the bout.
There was a lot of things said and done that were personal by him and me. It wasn't one-sided. So we got out of line on that. But at the end of it, we both knew that we had gotten out of line, and we both reached out to try to bury that because we're better than that. So he's a good guy. So it was one of those things where we were both got caught up in the moment, and we did what we did, but we rectified it.
Don won the bout, but paid a heavy price.
Oh, I had a hairline fracture on both ankles, and I got lucky because the ex-wife and I, we went to Hawaii instead of flying to L.A. like usual. Went to Hawaii, so it was only 4.5 hour trip, and I could barely make it off that plane. My ankles were swollen up, the size of my knees. I had ankles,
In 2001, station casino executives Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta purchased UFC from SEG Entertainment under the name Zuffa LLC. They bought a dying product, with many states having banned the sport entirely, and few cable companies offering the pay-per-view. The brothers, along with Dana White, knew the sport could blow up under the right guidance. They immediately instituted changes to the production, and made efforts to become regulated throughout the United States. A year into their investment, Zuffa was losing money. They needed a marquee matchup to drive pay-per-view sales. For UFC 40, Zuffa brought Ken Shamrock back to the cage to take on the face of the promotion, Tito Ortiz. The rivalry between Ken and Tito started years ago, with Tito's training partner.
This actually started with Tank. Tank and Ken didn't like each other. And the way that Ken Shamrock and the Lions didn't carry themselves in UFC, they were like the Cobra Kai. Like exactly what they were. They were the Cobra Kai team. They were little kids who were just had an attitude. He'd walk out with his chest all puffed out, and we're from Huntington, and Tank just didn't like him.
Early in Tito's career, he fought Lions Den fighters Jerry Bohlander and Guy Mesger. One of Tito's gimmicks was to wear a custom shirt after he won, insulting his opponent. Once Ken saw what was written on his shirt, he went nuts. John McCarthy pulled Tito away, only to have Tito famously flip off the Lions Den. The beef was real and easy to sell. Tito continues.
That team and Shamrock, he didn't like me and I didn't like him. And when he was in Pride in Japan, I told Dana to give me a fight with him. The feud was just perfect. It meant something because it was real. It wasn't prefabricated. It wasn't something that was done before. This was something that was brand new, and it was real rivalry between us.
Ken spoke with us about his mentality going into the fight.
And I just wasn't the same fighter when I came back from pro wrestling. I lost a lot of time. So trying to catch up to that, and I remember going in when I had the opportunity to do that. I realized I was fighting probably pound for pound the best fighter in the world at that time. And here I was with my age and injuries and all the things I had going on. that I was stepping in the ring against one of the best fighters in the world. And I remember feeling to myself like, dude, what am I doing? Everybody else who tried, they've been failing. They're getting ready to close the doors. And I realized that this was an opportunity to keep my legacy and this sport, this great sport alive, was that I had to try to win a fight, or at least go in and compete. And so I did the best I could with what I had to work with.
Although Ken would drop Tito with a punch in the first round, Ortiz went on to win the bout by TKO in the third. More importantly, however, was the national attention the bout received. Major outlets like ESPN and USA Today covered the show. The buy rate for that pay-per-view doubled any previous event. The success of UFC 40 showed Zuffa can make real money in the sport of MMA, and the UFC's popularity continued to grow.
After the bout, Ken revealed he injured his knee prior to the fight and was contemplating retirement. Years of wars in the cage and wrestling ring added up. In 2003, he had knee surgery, but was never the same. He lost a lot of mobility, and shooting for takedowns was difficult. From then on, he changed his strategy from primarily a ground fighter to one that mostly strikes.
On November 21st, 2003, at UFC 45, Ken Shamrock, along with Royce Gracie, were inducted as the first members of the UFC Hall of Fame. Dana White said, "We feel that no two individuals are more deserving than Royce and Ken to be the charter members. Their contributions to the sport, both inside and outside the octagon, may never be equaled." It meant a lot to Ken.
To me, what that does right there is basically solidify the importance of my career, and it'll always be there forever. I mean, it's like you can't take it away. It's like I was part of something special, and that I was a significant part of making it special. And so for that to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, it's something that my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, so on and so on, they will always recognize, whether I'm here or I'm in heaven. Either way, it's always going to be recognized.
At 40 years old, Ken returned to the cage and earned his final UFC win against Kimo Leopoldo, knocking him out with a knee in the first round. He continued in the promotion, losing to former UFC middleweight champion Rich Franklin. After a TKO loss to Sakuraba at Pride 30, he challenged Tito Ortiz in a rematch. The bout was heavily hyped, with Ken and Tito serving as opposing coaches for The Ultimate Fighter 3. The fight itself was anticlimactic, with Herb Dean stopping it prematurely, declaring Tito the winner. Ortiz vs. Shamrock 3, the final chapter, was shown live and free on Spike TV, and shattered ratings records for the company. Tito defeated Ken by TKO in the first. Tito reflected on their rivalry.
They always say, you get in a fight with somebody, it ends up becoming your friend after. And we did it 3 times, and yeah, he's a friend of mine, and I respect him hugely. And come to realize that we're all trying to do this for one thing, and everybody does it every single day: money. Ken's the one who started UFC. He's a grandfather for sure. He's one of the 4 heads on Mount Rushmore. I mean, he's one of the guys who put it on the map. If it wasn't for Ken Shamrock, he would have never had that personality. There was no personality at all besides Ken Shamrock at the time.
He finished his mixed martial arts career fighting for different promotions. He went 2-5, fighting for promotions like War Gods, Impact FC, and Bellator. He was a coach for the short-lived International Fight League. In the end, Ken Shamrock, the first king of Pancras, the first super fight champion, and Hall of Famer, ended his career with a record of 28-17-2.
Ken remarried in 2005 to his childhood friend Tanya. These days, he keeps himself busy with speaking engagements and his non-profit organization Lion's Den Ministries. Its mission is to reach and encourage those who are struggling, feeling hopeless and lost by sharing the message of faith through the testimonies of athletes, and those who have overcome their own struggles through the power and promises of God. He continues to forge new ground in combat sports, launching a new bare-knuckle boxing promotion called Valor Bare Knuckle.
Ken Shamrock was knocked down as a youth, abandoned at an early age. He rose up and forged a path with his fists and heart. Rage boiled inside, but he didn't let it consume him. Instead, he used it to mold a standard-bearing career. He was a cornerstone of the early days of mixed martial arts and became an example to those who grew up as hard as him. Ken's look, charisma, and success was a magnet for fans in the early days. He introduced people worldwide to the sport that is a monumental success today. He showed that if you never give up and play within the rules, you can achieve great things. Ken Shamrock's legacy will live on forever.
Like what you just heard? Check us out on Twitter and Instagram at MMA TrueFan. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. Please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Special thanks to Ken Shamrock, Tito Ortiz, Vernon White, Jason DeLucia, Don Frye, and Jerry Bohlander. Music by With Lions Productions. Artwork by Mike Zandt.